This move, 1, d4, immediately stakes a claim in the center and opens a diagonal for the queen and bishop, preparing to develop pieces and control key squares. This move mirrors white's central pawn advance, establishing symmetrical control of the d5 square and preparing for harmonious development of black's pieces in a classical queen's pawn game. This move immediately challenges black's central pawn, aiming to create imbalances and potentially gain a spatial advantage in the queen's gambit declined, or Slav defense territory. This move develops the bishop to a central square and prepares for kingside castling, establishing a solid pawn structure characteristic of the queen's gambit declined. This move, knight to f3, is a standard developing move that prepares for kingside castling and controls central squares, aiming to transpose into solid queen's pawn openings like the queen's gambit declined. This move, challenging white's central control and aiming to create an asymmetrical pawn structure, is known as the Tarrasch defense, a solid and theoretically rich opening. This capture resolves the tension in the center, opening lines and preparing to contest the d-file for potential central control or pawn breaks. This pawn capture correctly maintains central tension and opens the e-file for potential piece activity, leading into a Tarrasch defense variation. Developing the knight to c3 reinforces the central pawn on d4 and prepares for further development, typical in many queen's pawn structures arising after the queen's gambit declined. This move, nf6, is a fundamental developing move that prepares to castle and challenges white's central pawn on d5, aligning with common strategies in the queen's gambit declined. This move transitions into a Catalan structure, preparing to fianchetto the king's bishop to g2 to control the long diagonal and support a kingside attack. Developing the bishop to e6 supports the d5 pawn and prepares to castle, while also contesting white's control of the central squares. This move develops the bishop to a strong diagonal, preparing to castle kingside and adding pressure to black's d5 pawn. This move develops the knight to its most natural square, reinforcing the d5 pawn and preparing for further central development and potential queenside expansion. Castling kingside secures the king and prepares to connect the rooks, a fundamental development step in this queen's gambit declined variation. This move completes black's development of the kingside and prepares for castling, creating a solid and flexible pawn structure in this queen's gambit declined variation. This move simplifies the position by exchanging pawns, leading to a queen's gambit declined Marin variation structure where white aims to control the central squares and potentially exploit the d-file. This recapture maintains black's pawn structure and develops the bishop to an active square, preparing to challenge white's central control. White develops the bishop to pin the knight, preparing to exert more pressure on black's queenside pawn structure and potentially exploit weaknesses after the pawn exchange on c5. The move b7 is a solid choice, reinforcing the f6 knight and preparing for kingside castling, while also contesting the important diagonal for white's bishop on g5. This move, nd4, strategically repositions the knight to a central outpost, aiming to both attack black's isolated d5 pawn and potentially control key squares on the kingside, while preparing for kingside pawn advances or further piece development. This move, castling kingside, completes the development of black's minor pieces and ensures the safety of the king, preparing for central operations and reinforcing the d5 pawn. White reinforces control of the c-file, preparing to contest it with black's bishop and potentially apply pressure along this important open column. This move initiates a defensive maneuver to prevent white's bishop from potentially establishing a strong presence on the a2-8 diagonal, while also creating a potential escape square for the king should the center open up. This move repositions the bishop to a more active square where it influences the center and prepares to support a potential kingside attack. This move repositions the queen to a more active central square, preparing to contest the c-file and potentially support a queenside expansion while also offering support to the knight on f6. This move seizes the opportunity to disrupt black's queenside coordination, forcing a pawn recapture that allows white to challenge black's knight and potentially gain a central pawn majority in the future. This pawn recapture on e6 opens the f-file for black's rook and creates a doubled pawn on the e-file, which will require careful positional management. The bishop repositions to h3 to avoid being exchanged and to maintain its strong diagonal influence towards black's kingside, while also potentially preparing to reroute to a more active square. This move aggressively expands the kingside pawn structure, aiming to create space and potentially dislodge white's bishop, but it weakens the dark squares and the king's immediate safety. This move repositions the bishop to a more active square where it can control key diagonals and potentially support a kingside attack or defend against black's pawn advances. This pawn advance dynamically challenges white's central control and opens a pathway for black's pieces, particularly the queen, to become more active. This knight maneuver aims to reposition to a more active square, potentially attacking white's weak d4 pawn and supporting a central pawn push. This knight move aims to exploit the pressure on white's c-pawn and potentially create imbalances in the pawn structure, challenging white's control of the center. This move aims to redeploy the bishop to a more active square, potentially supporting a kingside attack or reinforcing the queenside defense after black's pawn push. This move repositions the queen to a more active central square, preparing to challenge white's control of the d4 square and potentially create counterplay. This move repositions the bishop to a more active square where it defends the d4 pawn and supports potential pawn breaks. This move repositions the queen to a more central square, aiming to attack white's pawn on e6 and potentially create threats against the white king, while also preparing to contest the crucial central squares. This move aims to centralize the queen, support the knight's advance to a potentially stronger square like e4, and prepare for potential queen trades if advantageous. This move repositions the knight to a more active square, potentially preparing to challenge white's control of the central light squares and prepare for further pawn breaks. This move, qg6+, forces the black king to move, disrupting black's pawn structure and potentially creating weaknesses around the king while white aims to exploit the exposed black monarch. Black's queen retreats to g7 to avoid the discovered check from the bishop and to maintain control of the g-file, preparing for potential defensive maneuvers. This queen sacrifice, delivering a decisive check and forcing the king into an exposed position, is a brilliant tactical execution that exposes black's king and initiates a mating attack, exploiting the weakness created by black's pawn structure. The move 22, kh8 is a necessary defensive maneuver to move the king away from the dangerous discovered attack threat that white's queen and bishop pose after the preceding checks, preparing to consolidate the position. This capture on c6 removes a key defender of the black king and opens lines for white's attack, exploiting black's weakened kingside pawn structure. Capturing the pawn on c6 opens the b-file for white's rook and severely weakens black's kingside pawn structure. creating persistent weaknesses. The capture of the c6 pawn opens the crucial c-file for white's rook, creating immediate pressure and disrupting black's defensive pawn structure. This move is a desperate attempt to complicate the position and bring the knight back into the game, but it allows white to deepen their attack on the kingside. This move aims to disrupt black's attacking potential on the kingside by dislodging the knight from its strong g5 outpost, while simultaneously creating potential attacking chances on the g-file if black recaptures. This move is a critical defensive maneuver, aiming to consolidate the rook's position and prevent the g4 pawn from advancing further, while preparing to contest the open c-file. This move activates the queen into a powerful attacking position, aiming to exploit white's temporarily weakened king's safety and pressure black's queenside pawns. Black recaptures the piece, opening the c-file for their rook and creating counterplay. But white maintains a dangerous pawn majority on the kingside and significant attacking potential. White captures the rook, simplifying the position and maintaining a material advantage, while black's king remains exposed. This move brings the rook to a more active central file, aiming to challenge white's control and potentially support a pawn advance or attack on the kingside. This move opens the g-file for your rook, creating immediate threats against black's weakened king after the capture of the f5 pawn. This move aims to unpin the knight on f5, which is currently pinned to the king by the rook on c6, allowing it to become a more active defender of the weakened kingside. White's queen retreats to e4, offering a trade of queens to simplify the position and exploit black's doubled pawns and potential kingside weaknesses after the pawn storm. This move aims to reposition the bishop to a more active diagonal, potentially supporting a regrouping or defending key squares on the queenside while the kingside is under attack. This move aims to disrupt black's queenside pawn structure and potentially gain an advantage on the queenside, creating weaknesses that white can exploit.